Right, the numbers keep coming in.
Mhm.
Right, they're starting to trickle in, so we will make a start. Welcome, thank you for joining us. Happy New Year for this webinar on what the Planning and Infrastructure Act now means for the sector. So welcome, thank you. We're going to run through some questions with the panel that we have here today with us. And then if we have some time, I'm hoping we can answer one or two questions at the end. So if you do have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A function. Feel free to use the chat function if you want amongst yourselves, but I'll only be checking the Q&A function. We are recording this, so it will be put on our YouTube channel along with previous webinars that we have done on the Planning Infrastructure Bill as it was. So if you want to go back and have a look at any of those, please do feel free. This one will be uploaded in the next couple of days as well. So moving on, without any further ado, let me introduce our panel for today. So we've got Richard Crompton, long-standing member who runs his own consultancy, Ecology on Demand, also runs training and is also putting together a new Ecology Expo. Welcome, Richard. Thank you for joining us. We've got Ben Kite, who is currently chair of the Strategic Policy Panel, CIEEM's Policy Committee, and is also a director at Ecological Planning and Research. Hi, Ben. We've got Craig Llewellyn, who is also a member of the Strategic Policy Panel and represents CIEEM on a number of external working groups and is an associate ecologist and biodiversity policy specialist at AtkinsRealis. And then we've got Steph Wray, who is a CIEEM past president, a CIEEM fellow, and currently freelance, but has worked in a number of roles in a number of sizes of organization and some various roles as well. Welcome, Steph. Welcome all. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
If we jump into the questions, Steph, if I come to you first, we've got the bill now, it's now an act. What do you think the single most important changes that the bill introduces that ecology professionals need to understand or take in?
Yeah, well, I mean, the key issues from part three of the Act are around this move from project by project, site-based mitigation and conservation action, if you like, to plan-based, levy-based approaches. So it's not an instant thing. It's not everything's going to change overnight. It will move in slowly. It will start with some of the areas where we're very used to doing things on a broader plan-based, levy-based level, like nutrient neutrality. But I think what we have now, the situation is that Natural England can designate a plan, an EDP, an environmental delivery plan, over any area for any topics. Now, at the start, this is going to be a very slow change, but ultimately, the idea is this could move out and encompass not just nutrients, but perhaps something like great crested newts. Eventually, the aspirations may even be for things like bats, where we might not think that that would work quite so well. So really, I'd say that was the biggest change, is a different way of looking at things. And whilst I think as ecologists, most of us would welcome an approach that was more strategic, where we tried to do nature recovery in a way that was bigger, better, and more joined up, the devil will very much be in the detail as to how these things will work.
Thanks, Steph. Craig, you got anything to add to that?
No, I think that's a good, Steph's presented a good summary there, I think. And as you say, a move away from project by project basis thinking, but also, of course, on-site mitigation requirements and this movement of trying to move things or conservation measures elsewhere through the Nature Restoration Fund. So I think it is a wholesale, sort of change. We'll go into some of the complexities, but there's the obvious ones, like how are they going to align with things like local plans, given local plans have got a lot of things that the Planning Act decided they didn't want in, such as the mitigation hierarchy, biodiversity within, compensating, enhancing on-site, protecting irreplaceable habitats. The list goes on. So There's going to be a lot of unpicking, I think, at first. And I am pleased, just like I'm sure everyone on the panel, that they're going towards diffuse pollution first. And of course, we'll need the secondary legislation to come as well, and the levy tool, etc. Because I think once they deviate away from diffuse pollution, apart from transferring over the great work that was done on newts in the licensing scheme, district licensing scheme, I think they'll find quite quickly they could get themselves tied in knots if this isn't planned out correctly.
Thanks, Craig. Ben or Richard, anything to add?
Go on, Richard.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, it also looks like they've chucked great crested newts in there, which I think came as a bit of a surprise to all of us. And as Steph mentioned before, it's going to be a concern if they roll that out to other species. Now, in some ways, it's interesting that GCM were chosen. The devil's going to be in the detail on this. I'm interested to see if it's going to follow the protocols established by district level licensing, by the DL scheme. Because if that's the case, then you can kind of see that would be chosen because there's an established protocol there, and so let's watch that very closely. I know the people involved in that are probably quite concerned, but keep it in context that we're probably only going to see a small number of these initially in this first year, perhaps 2 or 3, something of that measure. So I think that's important to bear in mind, and we just need to watch like a hawk if they start to propose these for other species. Not to say it can't work, but I think we're all very skeptical that it could work for other species. So it's getting those guardrails in place, and I think we need to consider also, are there alternative ways to doing what we can do? I think we run a risk of saying of just letting something be imposed, whereas if we've actually got suggestions to offer, I think that's also something to consider as well. We should look at perhaps what's going on in other countries and things like that, because we may suddenly find we're given, say, bats obviously is my field. We may suddenly find we're given a protocol which we've had very little input into. Perhaps we should be considering if there are alternative, potentially even better ways of doing what we could be doing, or at least a least worst kind of scenario. So many unknowns, which is what makes it so desperately unsettling.
Yeah, and I think like all three of you said so far, the devil's in the detail. We need to wait for that detail. Ben.
Very good points from Richard there. I think it's just worth slightly sort of reiterating and expanding a bit on the point that Steph and Richard touched on about the sort of likely rate of introduction of these EDPs, because until an EDP is introduced for an area, the normal rules apply. And it's likely, I think we've got to distinguish between what's possible and what's likely, because whilst the bill effectively allows an EDP, an everything everywhere EDP to be written that covers the whole country and does everything. Natural England and the Secretary of State would have to sort of abandon any pretense of doing this properly if they were to do it on that scale or on that speed. So it's very likely that this will pick in the, at least probably for the first couple of years at least, will pick out particular issues in particular places that are causing particular blockages. So they actually won't have much effect, at least in the short to medium term, on the practice of most ecologists, that be dealing with nutrient neutrality, potentially moving on to SANG, air quality, certain species, but over a reasonably slow time period if they're going to do it properly. So I think part of what, maybe we'll come onto this in questions to come, but part of our job will be providing the critical friend and the scrutiny of these things as they're rolled out to make sure that they're only done appropriately and at a speed that can be where all the guardrails that the others have mentioned can be put in place.
Thanks, Ben. Let's move on to some of that detail then. So if we talk about EDPs, environmental delivery plans, Craig, if I come to you first, do we think they represent a smarter, more strategic approach to nature recovery, or are they still a rollback of environmental protections, and are they going to work?
I do think that it is a rollback, only because obviously I think the way that Part 3 and the wording around EDPs doesn't really show a clear pathway to how these conservation measures are going to be delivered on the ground, even with the monitoring provisions that are in place in the Act. And there's also not a clear time frame between the impacts that are occurring on the development site on those features in the first place, and the time frame and how they're delivered as a conservation elsewhere. So I think that's quite unclear. I do think that we've got to talk about data here a lot, because Natural England, the government, and our Natural Nature Restoration Fund implementation plan that some of us might have had a chance to look at, it's quite clear that they're not sure what level of data is going to be needed once they move away from diffuse pollution issues. So the level of data is not clear, particularly if let's not pretend that the whole point of this is to reduce the amount of project and on-site survey and assessment. That is a huge reason for this. So without accurate baseline data in the first place, I think there's an overhanging question on data there and what that means. In terms of other rollbacks, Jason, this talk about things like irreplaceable habitats that through CIEEM we worked hard to try and get the government to exclude irreplaceable habitats from the Bill Now Act. That didn't work. We didn't get much from them. We were due a statement to show that they wouldn't be included. I think that sort of sends a dangerous precedent in itself. And then there's a lot of confusion. I've already touched upon local plans, but there's also about how the overall improvement test would actually work in practice. So we've got some wording in an act, but there's no barriers to show how that works, what's bad, what's good, what isn't, what works. So, and then of course, finally, let's not forget that there's the automatic granting of protected species licenses. This is again written into the act that the payment into levy can ensure that protected species license in place is treated as granted. That also sets a dangerous precedent, and particularly with regard to the favourable, conservation status of our species. So I think there's a lot there that can suggest that we've rolled back and not gone forward.
Thanks. Ben?
I mean, I think it's important in terms of the way the question was phrased to distinguish between the Act and EDPs, because to my mind, the Act itself, there's no doubt that that's a regression on environmental standards. The OEP said so. The main reason for that is because the legislation wasn't written narrowly enough to make sure that EDPs would definitely be positive. That's the problem. That's why the sector got so upset about it. EDPs, however, could be written in a positive way or a negative way. Just because the Act allows them to be written in a way that could be negative and harmful doesn't mean they will be, or that we should expect that to be the case. So really,
but we have to go on what we know, don't we? And what we know at the moment is that it's not been good. The trajectory that this has gone hasn't been positive. So we've got to go on the information we know what not could be. And I agree, it could be hopefully something better in the way EDPs could be written in a way perhaps that isn't what we already know and what we've worked towards through this. And I hope you're right, but it's not good, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, point taken. Really, what I'm saying is that's where we need to be. Really, is to make sure that, given the scope within which EDPs can be written from very bad to very good, we need to make sure that the ones that come out are at the very good end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
We've got to use our lobbying and our advocacy and our scrutiny and our voice to make sure that's expected, and the government realises that that's what people want, both not just the sector but the public in general.
Thanks, Ben. Steph?
Well, I mean, nothing to add to Ben other than I agree it's regression. However, will they work as intended? What was the intention of the Act? Well, it was the Act was there to speed up development, wasn't it? It's about growth and the speeding up growth agenda. Will it do that? Probably not. In all honesty, because there's no evidence really that's been produced for us yet that demonstrates that nature and ecological surveys and mitigation are significantly holding back growth. Everyone can point to a case where there was a small delay around some ecological issue that was found late in the process, but equally, we can point to lots of developments where other things have held it up. There are lots of other reasons why affordable houses aren't being built, and it's, not to do with the process of development at all. So will it deliver the government's growth agenda in and of itself? No, it won't. Will it contribute to it? Hard to say, depends on how it's implemented. Will it benefit developers? I think some small developers are feeling quite positive about it, where they're unhappy with having to do some things for nature as part of their projects that they don't see as being part of their job. But a lot of the larger responsible developers are quite as negative about it as the ecology profession, in all honesty, and not really feeling it's going to take them forward any further.
Okay, thanks. If we move on a little bit then to the nature restoration funds, we've got areas covered by an EDP. Developers will be able to pay into the NRF, the Nature Restoration Fund, instead of complying with parts of various bits of wildlife legislation. What do we think the biggest risks with this are? Ben, if I can come to you first, please.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that although the government's sort of and Natural England, in fact, have sort of tried to emphasise that they expect EDPs to be voluntary in most cases, that's not necessarily always going to be the case. It can be mandatory. So some of these risks of going down an EDP route, a developer might not be able to avoid if the EDP is mandated. The most obvious reason why an EDP might be mandated is because the particular mitigation needs to get to a certain amount of money before it can even begin. So if a land purchase is necessary, for example, they've got to be able to guarantee that a certain amount of money is available in order to make that land purchase. Otherwise, the entire EDP won't work. So we have to wait and see what that happens. But some of these risks of a developer going down the EDP route might not be ones they can avoid by rowing their own boat, because they might not be able to row their own boat. Where an EDP is mandatory, the main risks that I see for developers are, first one is financial, in that there's no guarantee, I don't think, that these economies of scale that the government thinks are there are actually there, in terms of pooling resources and being able to do things more cost effectively, particularly given that EDPs are going to have to incorporate backup measures and remediation measures and monitoring and that sort of thing. And given the track record of some of these strategic schemes, I mean, I think 33 million has been poured into Natural England's nutrient neutrality scheme, and since 2020, I think a month ago, we learned that since 2023, only 2,999 homes had been delivered out of the 40,000 that it was supposed to unlock. So there is a question mark, I think, over whether or not it's going to be cost effective, although the jury's still out on that. It could be. I think the other main risks for developers really are reputational, sort of related to reputation, in that if you effectively discharge your commitments to the environment and society by paying money into a pot, and then that pot doesn't do what it's meant to, the measures don't materialize, or they're ineffective, or they're miles away, and the local stakeholders don't see them, so they see the loss on their doorstep, but they never see the benefit. Then that's not going to be good for the reputation of those developers, really. It's not going to be something that they would want to be associated with. And sort of related to the local issues, really, I think there's a sort of the risks which can be mitigated of sort of inadvertently straying into the realm where offences are committed, because the assumption's been made that it's okay to go ahead and kill the animals on site because their legal protection has been removed by an EDP, by a granted license, but actually you still have to look after the welfare of those animals because of other legislation that isn't disapplied, and a confusion and oversight happening in that. Now, that's of course something the developer can take in hand. They can make sure they can still get advice from ecologists on how do we deal with that. But those issues are interrelated, because if new sites are being created for species elsewhere, Natural England might put conditions on EDPs that still require those animals to be sort of scooped up and moved somewhere, or to be dispatched humanely. But that's not those are things that developers are not really going to want to be associated with. If animals are being effectively being killed on a large scale by this, and it'll be obviously very visible, particularly to local stakeholders, to people that live nearby. So there's a lot of question marks, really, and a lot to iron out and for EDPs to think carefully about before they're rolled out, particularly for species.
Thanks. Steph, anything to add?
Yeah, well, I'd agree with all of those points. I think the problem is that because this is very new and it's going to be a while before these things bed in, and Natural England knows at what level to set the levies. There's obviously concern about affordability to developers. There's concern about have we got enough money to actually do anything meaningful? And this hasn't been pump primed by government any meaningful way to kick this off in a way that's really going to make it effective. So I think we've got that sort of credibility issue, the affordability issue. We know that in the first year of purchase of statutory credits for BNG. Nothing was spent on nature recovery. The whole amount that developers paid on statutory credits was eaten up by administering the system. So there's a real danger here that we've just built ourselves a new bureaucratic system that isn't actually going to deliver anything, but is going to decrease the amount of environmental protection out there on site. And I think that's significant. The risk, of course, then that comes out of that is that if government sees that it's not being effective and developers are complaining that it's expensive and their money's not getting spent in the right way, that the agenda gets pushed again and this rolls out faster than we have the data to support. And I think that's the real risk, that in pursuit of this growth agenda, it gets pushed much too fast.
Indeed. Richard or Craig, anything to add?
Just really, no, I agree with everything that's been said there. I think it just risks already looking quite messy. I think even where, because the EDPs, of course, don't have to select all environmental features. An EDP can be made for up to a singular environmental feature. So you could have your that feature be, say, for dormice, but your developer still has to go through the usual hoops in the planning system. So this still could mean there'd be requirements for EIA and ECIA. And then, of course, we've got things that we know that weren't mentioned directly in the Act or in any of the EDP stuff sent so far around BNG, obviously still occurring. So there's a lot of things here that could get stacked on top of each other, I think, and become quite messy. And also, think about local scrutiny here as well. And I keep coming back to local plans. I know we've had changes in the NPPF, which will trickle down, of course, to local plans. But local plans say an awful lot of no's to a lot of this, and rightly so, that, EDPs can be quite dangerous, I think. And local scrutiny, people watching on by that areas, green space and on-site ecological mitigation is, making it, or could almost be a thing of the past in some of these EDP cases. And I think that only looks poorly upon government as well, regardless of whether you're trying to scoop up animals and move them elsewhere. The fact of the matter is that this is a payment to trash. I think we need to call things for what they are, and it is a payment to trash, and that's what it's, and I think that's a very dangerous thing indeed. So I just think there's a lot of considerations here, but how it forms with, like I said, EIA in particular, regulations, and BNG is going to be quite interesting.
Thanks. Richard, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, lots of great points there. And just a little thing to add to that really is, of course, there's going to be things like, it's been sold as a one-stop shop to developers, and I think they're going to be rudely surprised when they find out that they're going to get a bill for hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds potentially for a site. We don't know that. We don't have that detail yet. I don't think it's going to be cheap. And then they find that they're also going to have to do some degree of species survey, species translocation, species mitigation, because it's not included in an EDP. I think that's going to come as a very rude surprise. And you only have to look at the prosecutions, the wildlife prosecutions that take place, to understand that particularly the big companies, they're not bothered about fines, but what they don't want is bad PR. They don't want Swampy camped up every tree or chained to every gate post or every JCB on a site, because something could be anything from rabbits right up to, the most protected European protected species. The local people, as Craig says, are not just going to stand by and watch this happen. And then there is, of course, also the welfare legislation as well. When Marion Spain, the chief exec of Natural England, spoke to the select committee, she was surprisingly vague on what the source of data was going to be for surveys, and sort of made reference to the fact that they'd use Natural England data. Well, Natural England don't really hold any data. So it's an interesting point. I mean, you could argue that it's all in their license returns, but um, we know that information doesn't get widely used and isn't in a very accessible format. So it's something I'll probably come back to later also, but it's going to be really critical that we all have records for anything vaguely important or anything very common in the record centres. I think it's going to, in terms of us keeping a watching brief on what's going on, to making sure that things aren't being overlooked, we need to make sure that every possible bit of data is in a publicly acceptable source, preferably the local record centre.
Thanks. There was a concerning comment about the longevity of data, I think, as well, that I think raised a few eyebrows. Moving on, Ben, we've already mentioned about nutrient neutrality being one of the first things used for the system of EDPs. What should we be watching for firstly as these start to roll out?
I think a key thing is going to be looking at how any new EDP deals with and treats organizations that have already brought forward or are bringing forward nutrient neutrality solutions, because that could have fairly profound effects beyond the EDP area. So, if you're a wildlife trust and you brought forward a nutrient mitigation scheme that involves retiring a polluting farm, for example, and selling those credits to developers, and an EDP effectively rides roughshod over that and provides a tariff that means that you no longer have any customers, other people wanting to bring forward those solutions in other parts of the country that are affected by nutrient neutrality are going to look at that and thinking, wow, that's a major risk to my business. I can't risk bringing this forward if that's what happens. So I'm not going to do it anymore, because if that happens, then everywhere that's not covered by that EDP is then going to be starved of mitigation solutions, and the developers in those areas are going to be held up significantly. So really what EDPs need to do, I think, is there needs to be a very careful negotiation with the providers of existing solutions that sort of onboards them onto the process or allows them to sit alongside an EDP without being undermined by that ADP, so they still have a business, and there's still a reason, therefore, for people to bring forward mitigation and offer it to developers to keep development coming forward and to keep the supply of mitigation. Because if that doesn't happen, if that doesn't go well, that could be sort of catastrophic for the delivery of growth and development, as well as for nature. I mean, I think the other main thing to look at is, for me, the biggest risk with nutrient related EDPs is the time lag and the gap between taking your nature restoration fund payment off the developer and allowing them to get going, and then being able to use those pooled funds to do something positive to offset the nutrients, because that isn't necessarily a quick process. You might have to buy a piece of farmland and retire the polluting operation. You might have to design, get planning permission for, and then create an interceptor habitat on a stream that's draining pollution into a watercourse, for example. So in theory, at least, there's going to be a time lag where, for a while, money is being collected from developers. Those developers are building, they're adding sewage to the network, to the local wastewater treatment works, and the pollution is going up in the river before the solutions are then finally delivered, which could take years, which then starts to bring it back down again. Now, if that process is relatively quick, that might not be a problem. But if it isn't quick, and a significant amount of development is consented without mitigation, then you might permanently lose things in those catchments. So you might, that your salmon might disappear, your sort of water crowfoot beds and habitats might go, your lamprey, all sorts of sensitive features, freshwater pearl mussels, whatever it is, you could permanently lose those things from a catchment in a way that they could only ever be brought back with human help, and that would be an irreversible damage. So for me, we've got to stay on Natural England when the details of these EDPs, first EDPs, are published for consultation. We've got to look at how realistic it is that the measures can be brought to bear to deliver the benefits, and what the time gap and lag is likely to be, and how big a risk is embedded in that time lag.
Thanks, Ben. Would anyone else like to come in on the first EDPs that will be on nutrient neutrality?
I just checked quickly on my notes here, but as far as I can work out, the minister's written to DEFRA to notify that Natural England's decided to prepare 23 EDPs. So this might just be interesting for people to know. So this is as best knowledge as I can glean. Please correct me if anybody's got any better information on this. 16 EDPs for nutrient pollution from development affecting protected sites, and 7 EDPs for great crested newts for development, including infrastructure in parts of England. So that's the first thing. But also, as far as I can work out, there's going to need to be at least 2 further sets of secondary legislation before we can get to that point. There's got to be draft guidance on the NRF, user testing of the digital service of the NRF. So there's quite a lot more to go. So I think, I think as Ben says there, between the point of them even being allowed to pay their money and getting something useful out of it is going to be a long time, let alone what the impact is actually going to be on the environmental receptor.
That's great, thank you. Craig, can I come to you and move us on a little bit with EDPs beyond nutrient neutrality and newts? Government have said they'll come to Parliament with a statement of evidence before they move on to anything else. What are we hoping for, or what are we going to be looking for in that evidence?
It's tricky, isn't it? Because I suppose as an industry, Jason, and through CIEEM, we've obviously worked quite tirelessly to show the holes in the thinking once they move away from diffuse pollution. So all the obvious ones, talking about environmental context and being really clear that for a lot of species and for specific habitats, you simply can't relocate or move something elsewhere for the sake of creating conservation measures. So I think there's got to be something in here though around safeguards and set out some no-go areas in all this, but they can't really do that until we've got an idea of the charging schedule and how they're going to design the levy. I'm sort of at the moment on the fence of how where they can go from this. Not because I'm short of ideas, but we've obviously already given our say on what would work and what won't work, and obviously it's largely not been listened to. There's things that I'd like more information on. I think once we move past diffuse, as you say, nutrient neutrality, diffuse pollution issues. I'd like more information on what the overall improvement test will actually entail, and what it would mean and what it will mean and how it will be signed off, not just by Natural England, but how it will be interpreted by the Secretary of State, who will have the final sign off. I also want to know a bit more, given that Natural England have said that in their NRF plan that they want to use robust ecological evidence and scientific literature and so on and so forth to make sure they use good information to form their future EDPs. We need to look at how they're collating that, where are they getting their research from, where are they getting their data. There should be if there isn't already, there should be a separate independent panel set up with stakeholders like ourselves who can, as soon as they move away from diffuse pollution, that they can come to us and we can sit down and really look at the evidence about what works and what doesn't. So sorry if that hasn't answered your question directly, but I hope that's given a bit of an insight anyway.
Yeah, I mean, part of the point was to raise the issue, wasn't it? That we don't know what they're going to look like.
Exactly.
So we don't know.
Yeah.
I suppose it's worth just interjecting here quickly that we have been invited to join the EDP delivery group through Natural England. So we will have some insights into how they are being developed, but we don't know anything at the moment. Ben, did you want to add anything to that?
Just briefly, and that the government's commitment to produce a sort of lesson learned type report and lay that before Parliament for expanding the scope of EDPs. That was obviously a sort of concession made to answer the concern that was enshrined in Baroness Willis's proposed amendments to the bill that sought to limit EDPs to diffuse pollution issues until this a process of evidence gathering and analysis had taken place to establish for what purposes EDPs might be effective going forward. So Baroness Willis's concern really was that we need to know that they work before we roll it out to other things. Now, and I think that Baroness Willis and Peers for the Planet still believed that the government were going to take that line up until at least until 11th of December, because there's a blog on their website that suggests that that they understood that this was the concession that the government had made, that it would do that. It would look at what worked and then look at taking EDPs forward for other things. But the government's implementation plan for EDPs that's just been published, I think, says something different. It says that a statement of the learnings will be laid before Parliament once the first EDPs are made. So that implies that once they've written the first ones, they'll put something on paper about what it was like to write it, put that before Parliament, and then look to roll out EDPs. Now, if that's what is meant in the implementation plan, that's obviously completely unacceptable, because the whole point of this concern and what everyone thought was being addressed by the dispatch box concession the government made was, we need to know if they work and what might go wrong with them before we roll them out, not what was your experience writing it. We need to actually see it implemented, see where the pitfalls are, see what goes wrong, and make sure that those mistakes are not repeated in future EDPs. That's the whole point of this. So if what the government mean by tabling a statement of learnings before Parliament after the first EDPs are made is that they will not allow any time for any lived experience of how EDPs work on the ground to filter back and any meaningful analysis to be done, then I don't think that's good enough, and I think we need to be rattling that particular saber.
Yeah.
And that's always the
Ben,
danger in the political context, isn't it? Sorry, Steph, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and the only formal requirements to report back on an EDP are at the halfway point and at the end. Well, I don't really think we're waiting till the halfway point of these first 23 EDPs before we start rolling out EDPs in lots of other areas and lots of other topics. So we really do have to be looking at data outside of the EDP process about what is likely to work, rather than expecting to have learnt anything much from the early EDPs.
That's great, thanks. Craig or Richard, anything on that one? That's great. Steph, I'll stay with you. We've talked about Natural England already. They have a huge job really in setting up EDPs, and then also in implementing and administering and rolling out the Nature Restoration Fund as well. What are we hoping to see from Natural England? What do they need to be doing?
What we want to see from them is integrity. We want to see the data. We want to see the scientific basis on which decisions are being made and on which EDPs are being rolled out. We want to see them take advice. There's a lot to be said for the culture of stakeholder engagement, but in decisions around this on scientific principles, some stakeholders are more equal than others. We would quite like them to listen to and hear expert advice on the topics where they're working, not just take a broad view of all the stakeholders. And what do you think, Mr. House Builder, about dormice? And what do you think, Man on the Clapham Omnibus, about dormice? There is a difference in the information that you'll receive. So I do want to see that real commitment to understanding the best possible evidence. And then I think we need openness. We need them to be really honest and open with us about the decisions that they're taking and what they think will work, and engage with the profession really in a clear and transparent dialogue. We want to help. We want this to work. If this is the system we're working in, hey, we're adaptable people. We'll work within it, but we want to do it properly. We want to do it based on scientific evidence, and we want to do it with integrity. In terms of what do I want them to spend the money on, I want them to spend it on nature. There's this huge sort of myth of investment in nature at the moment, and most of it is investment in nature businesses, nature credit platforms, nature tech, and very little money is being diverted to nature and restoring nature on the ground. And that's what this system has got to be. EDPs have got to be incredibly agile, incredibly lean, and just deliver on the ground, because this is a crisis and we don't have time to wait.
Thanks, Steph. Ben, Ben, anything to add?
Well, I first of all, so I'd put my name down as a sponsor for Steph's manifesto. I think that's what what I'd like to see as well. I think the only thing that I'd add to it really is that I want to see Natural England being quite brave in terms of offering themselves up for oversight, scrutiny, and peer review. You know, whether that's the OEP, whether that's the profession in general. I think they've got to set a high standard. Basically, you know, their job as a regulator means that they must criticize the people who get it wrong in others, but you know they're the ones that look over the shoulders of developers and mark their homework and say no, that's not good enough. So now really they have to be setting an example for everybody else that's involved in the system, and that means being brave and offering up your efforts to the criticism of others, hopefully constructive criticism. You know, we all need to be critical friends in this process. Basically, we need to say you need to do better, and this is how you do better. So yeah, I think I want them to be brave in offering up and in transparency and offering up their work for comment and feedback. And I also want to see them resisting pressure to write inappropriate EDPs. I think because the safeguards that we were all fighting for were not put into the Act, as I said earlier, EDPs could be very, very good or very, very bad. And it's inevitable, I think, at some point that they're going to be put under considerable political pressure to write very, very bad, rushed EDPs because there's a political need to deliver something, a politician's pet project somewhere. And I think they need to be brave in resisting that and say, if there isn't the evidence to write something quickly, we can't do it. If we're going to do it, it's got to work and it's got to be evidence based.
Thanks, Ben. I'm conscious of time, so I'll move on. The last two questions, though, I'd like some input from all of you, really. So, the first question is that there's been a lot of policy changes over the last year. We've had this is the Planning and Infrastructure Act. We've had announcements for changes to BNG, which will have been announced, but we'll see the legislation or the policy changes coming shortly. We've got a consultation on National Planning Policy Framework. There's a whole load of changes up in the air. What advice would you give to ecologists on the ground for this year ahead with these coming changes? What should they be planning and preparing for? Richard, could I come to you first, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's such a lot to take on board at the moment. I think every company, particularly the sole traders, freelancers, and the small and medium-sized companies, need to do something of a risk assessment exercise in all of this. Look at the exposure to geography, where you work, what countries you're working in. Obviously, most of what we're talking about primarily affects England. Although interestingly, colleagues in the planning system in Wales are also saying they're feeling the difference, even over here in Wales as well. But think about exposure in terms of geography, in terms of where your income comes from. What's your sectoral exposure? Large housing, infrastructure, BNG, because we've also got the Fingleton review, or the Nature Fund for Nuclear, as it's been termed, just to think about as well. So this is all, all of these things to consider. So look at what's the safest part of your work. Look at what your exposure is to the more risky parts. Can you reallocate? Can you change your business model in any way to respond? And it's well to think about this before the main survey season, because although most of these things are not likely to impact basically any of us in 2026, 2027 will soon be here. And we just don't know quite how fast some of these things will be pushed through. Let's bear in mind that the Labour manifesto was for 1.5 million homes, this Parliament, and the general election must be no later than August 2029. They're significantly behind on this target at the moment, as Steph says. They're blatantly going to miss it, but this is certainly one of the drivers behind all of these initiatives, is to pump prime large infrastructure and to get more houses built. So think about the impact of that on all of our businesses, and look for the opportunities that are going to be less risky going forward.
Thank you. Steph, can I come to you?
Sure. First and foremost, I'd say don't panic. There is so much for this industry to do. It's so important, and realization, yes, we might be fighting and have lost a first battle on this particular front, but there is a lot changing in national and international policy around understanding the importance of nature and underpinning everything we do. So ecology as a profession isn't going to go away. It's not going to be, hobbled terribly by this. It's going to change what we do, and it's going to change how we work to some extent. And at the risk of being a bit Pollyannish, it's going to help us to innovate. It's going to help us to think about new ways of doing things. If this industry, if this level of policy is going to be more strategic, we have to be more strategic. We might need to brush up our skills in some areas, perhaps that we haven't. We might have focused all our graduates in this field into, oh, you must get your survey skills and you must get your licenses and this sort of thing. And well, maybe we need to be guiding them more towards really understanding ecological restoration and land management and getting new and more diverse skills that can be applied at this more strategic level. It gives us an opportunity to collaborate, both within the profession, but also with developers to find ways to make this work. We're entering a really sort of complicated time, a really fragmented approach to how we deal with ecology and development. And developers are going to be finding their way the same as we are. So it's an opportunity to work together and understand each other's perspectives better and find better solutions. And if you'll indulge me with one tiny story, back at the beginning of my career, in the 1990s, before we had most of our survey standards and mitigation guidelines and so forth, and we were really making it up as we went along based on scientific first principles. We did all sorts of crazy things. I've emptied once I tracked out a pond for Great Crested Newt. I had emptied a pond with a milk tanker and moved the water and all the lovely newt food to the new pond. Nobody would make you do that under license these days. But this is the kind of crazy thing. We can find ways because, as we've said earlier, developers aren't going to want to be on the reputational sharp end of just trashing nature. So even if we've paid into a levy, we're going to still be finding ways to do things for nature on site and to do mitigation on the hoof. And I think it's a difficult time, it's a risky time, but it's also a potentially exciting new dawn for the profession as well.
Thank you, Steph. Ben.
Steph said a lot of it very well already. I'd reiterate, don't panic. I think I think there's still going to be plenty for ecologists to do. The need for our profession and our skills has never been more acute, and it's only going to grow basically. Even with sort of changes to BNG recently, BNG added a huge amount extra to our workloads, and all the change did was take that additional workload down a bit. So I certainly I've never been worried about this from the perspective of, is it going to stop our work? Is it going to stop our profession from being needed? I've never been really that concerned about that element of this at all. I've been much more worried about the potential environmental outcomes than I have been about our livelihoods and our well-being really. In terms of repositioning ourselves, I think we need to recognise as a profession that although the justification for EDPs and the EDP-based approach has been slathered in misinformation, and is the justifications that are used aren't real often. There is a kernel of truth in them, in that ecological processes have often been applied with sort of unthinking slavishness that has caused extra costs that weren't necessary, delays that weren't necessary. Whether it's taking guidance and applying it literally. So, you're one day over your validity period for survey, and all of a sudden you have to repeat the whole survey program. It has happened. It does happen. Making people do large amounts of survey for situations that they could have, almost foretold with a small amount of survey, and so that the cost of designing the mitigation far outweigh the cost of putting the mitigation in. All those sorts of things that have been a factor of at least some practice. we need to get a grip on that, and we need to iron that out, and we need to reposition and reskill ourselves so that we are better suited to this sort of strategic Lawton Principles way of working: bigger, better, more joined up. Whether that's skilling up in habitats so that we can look at habitats on a landscape scale and deal with pressures on species that way. Whether it's learning about policy and legislation so we can really get to grips with the mechanisms to make those things real and make them happen. It's basically what we have to do is change our skill sets to suit this more strategic way of working, and there are lots of risks and dangers in this transition, but as Steph says, also opportunities. And if we get it right and we keep the pressure up on those that are driving it to do the right thing, then we can make it better.
Thank you. Craig.
I don't have too much more to add. I think, Steph and Ben have spoken well on that point. I think as well, that was touched upon that this is going to be about in the next year ensuring we're very clear with developers. Our relationships with developers are very clear as well, because once this all comes along, it's going to get potentially more confusing, particularly I think in the short term. So I think being a good communicator in all of this with our fellow, not just developers, but local authorities and other ecologists, don't forget. I think this has to be about knowledge sharing and lessons learned approach as well. And I think, as I think Richard said as well, I think it could be 2027. Yeah, the time some of this really comes to play. Even the BNG exemption change isn't immediate. That will have to go through a level of laid down in Parliament again. And the NPPF changes, I haven't gone through them yet, but so I don't know how drastic they are. And then, as we've seen from the government schedule on rolling all this out, we've got the secondary legislation engagement to come over the winter, and then consultation on the first EDPs, digitalisation of everything, the levy schedules, and so on. So I think there's a long way to go in all of this. We just got to look out for each other and make sure that as professionals we lend our hand out to those that need it as they formulate these, and that's Natural England. And Natural England have got a huge amount of talent. So let's not, and they'll be concerned about this themselves. They know what they've landed with. They want to do it well. So let's make sure we help them along the way with it as much as possible.
Thank you. Last question then is just looking ahead to the rest of 2026. What do we think our top policy priority needs to be as a sector and as CIEEM? Ben, can I come to you first, please?
Sure. I think Craig hit on it really with what he said last, in that we need to offer our expertise and our knowledge and our support to Natural England to help them get this right, because this is certainly for England the policy priority, I think. But also be a critical friend to them. We mustn't undermine what they're doing. We've got to support it, and that means offering up knowledge, expertise, information, pointing out where we think they're getting things wrong, and offering solutions to that, and giving them every advantage we can possibly afford them to make sure they do get it right. And I think if we do that, we're also going to help to counter the misinformation that generated this approach in the first place. The caricature that's been applied to us as a sector, that we're somehow anti-human needs, that we're putting the convenience of pipistrelles over the right for people to have warm, comfortable homes and food to eat. That is nonsense. That's not what we're about. We're pro-nature. We're not anti-human. So it's really the gauntlet's been thrown down, and we have to demonstrate that. We have to demonstrate that our interest is in improving environmental outcomes, not in making life worse for people.
Thank you, Ben. Richard, could I come to you, please?
Yeah, I mean, all of this proportionality. Let's not overcook what we're currently doing. People have heard me use the examples of £10,000 spent on surveys and licensing for 100 quid's worth of bat boxes to be the result. Let's try and flip some of this on its head, because it attracts criticism, and that's kind of what's got us into this mess. I firmly believe that. Certainly helping colleagues throughout the whole sector and our associated sectors, planning and architecture and the like as well, navigate some of this. I think that's going to be really important. And also pointing out, the opportunities that sit within there. Let's not give up on it. It's not just roll over and die. It's we're not in that position yet. There's some great initiatives going on. I just made a note of a few here. Things like business and biodiversity assessments, nature positive frameworks, science-based targets for nature, global biodiversity stocktake. Lots of these things, very positive things taking place. A lot of companies, a lot of very large companies, including some of the big infrastructure companies and housing, they want to be seen to be doing the right thing. They know that green and pleasant areas or houses in green and pleasant areas sell better. So that all makes a lot of sense. And there's also quite a deal of philanthropy out there. There's some very rich people. I mean, of all the bizarre things, I've currently got a client, and my contract brief is to make his country estate that he's bought brilliant for bats. There are people out there like this. There are people that want to make a difference, and there will be people that will strive for the best possible standards, regardless of what the legal minimum may be. So let's keep focusing on the opportunities and the positives out there. It's not all doom and gloom, and we've certainly got some breathing space yet.
That's great. Thank you. Craig.
I think really, I think everyone's highlighted it pretty well. I think I think my last point really around ensuring that we support Natural England all the way with this, and be friends, and be constructive as we go through this. So I haven't really got too much more to add really. It's a scary time in some ways, but as others have alluded to, it's also an exciting time to be an ecologist in some ways. The industry has moved forward a lot in the last, since I started to now. It's evolved. It's moved in different directions, and there's been a lot of positive action come from it. So I think we need to just keep our heads up and carry on, go through the motions, and make sure we support Natural England in particular as they produce these EDPs.
Thank you, Craig. And Steph, the last word.
Oh, the last word. Right, I'm going to go high level because I do. Yes, all of this stuff is really important, and we need to keep working closely on specific local policy issues in the UK. But there is a much bigger picture about global biodiversity loss, and the UK is a signatory of the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which has a load of targets around biodiversity, reversing the loss of biodiversity by 2030, and it's 2026. So I think we really need to make a big push on those issues, like the 20 by 20 the 30 by 30 target, rather, the mandatory disclosure of biodiversity impacts and so forth. But the key, I think, for me to that is one of the things that we've been talking about around our concerns on EDPs and whether they'll work is, where's the money coming from? Where's the pump priming? Where's making sure that we can deliver action on the ground? One of the targets in the Global Biodiversity Framework is identify and reverse subsidies which are damaging to nature. The UK subsidises fossil fuels to the tune of 17.5 billion per year. If we could redirect even a small proportion of that into nature restoration, wow, what a difference we could make. And I think we need to look that the money is there to do this. We shouldn't be fobbed off with a paltry few million here and there into Natural England. We need some big bucks, and we know where we could get it from.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I am very conscious of time, that time is up. We've had a number of questions come in. So what I will do is we'll take those and we will add them to the notes when we upload it. And I'll answer the ones I can, and I'll get the panel to answer the ones I can't. But we'll have to leave it there. So I just want to say thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much for everyone who's tuned in. We've had a huge number for this, so that's brilliant. Hopefully you're feeling a little more positive than maybe when we started this conversation and how we ended last year. That yes, don't panic. I think, as Steph and Ben have said. And we will keep up the good fight on this indeed, from CIEEM and from the sector. As I mentioned earlier, we have recorded this, so we will put it on our YouTube channel, so that'll be up in the next couple of days. And then just a reminder that we are keeping the Planning and Infrastructure Bill Act webpage open as well, so all of the resources are still on there. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Cheers.